Long before American independence, an institutional struggle for political power had already been taking place inside the 13 colonies. Colonial assemblies were at the center of that struggle. They served as early political and hegemonic apparatuses through which colonial elites learned the practices of self-government and gradually weakened British authority from within the imperial system. Political autonomy within the British Empire. Colonial America possessed a political sphere that was relatively autonomous from its economic base. Political institutions served as arenas in which conflicts and contradictions between Britain and the colonies could be negotiated and temporarily resolved. For a long time, the colonial assemblies worked effectively as stabilizing mechanisms. But political struggles over power had begun well before the outbreak of the revolution. From the beginning of colonization, these institutions were modeled on the British political system. Settlers received royal charters that established a legal framework based on English law for governing the new territories. The elected lower houses, modeled on the British House of Commons, were particularly important. They empowered the colonial elite and gave it a distinct form of political authority. Nevertheless, the highest level of political power remained outside the colonies. It rested with the British Parliament and with the system of royal gubernatorial appointments. In 8 colonies, governors were appointed by the Crown. Only Connecticut and Rhode Island elected their own governors. The upper house, known as the Council, was appointed either by the Crown or by the colony's proprietors. Self-governing colonies, however, were followed to appoint their own councils. Council members came predominantly from the colonial elite. Only a minority were officials sent from Britain. In either case, the council primarily defended the interests of the colonial elite. The struggle for power. Unlike the council, the elected lower house became a more important arena of conflict with the ruling authorities. It struggled for political power against both the governors and the council. Over time, the lower houses gradually assumed some functions of the executive branch. They demanded the right to appoint civil servants and eventually to control colonial finances. This process progressively weakened the influence of the British government. The historian Karl Becker famously observed that the conflict was not only about home rule, it was also about who should rule at home. In other words, colonial political rights were only one part of the struggle. An increasingly important question was which social and political forces would preserve those rights and decide how they will be implemented. In a Gramscian sense, the legal framework of ideological hegemony remained rooted in British constitutional rights. But the struggle increasingly unfolded within political society, around the question of which political subject will govern on the basis of those rights. It was therefore a political struggle within an emerging colonial pre-state apparatus. Participation in colonial political life partly represented the development of political autonomy and became a precursor to independence. The class basis of colonial politics. Although colonial assemblies possessed a degree of autonomy from Britain and the economic base, they were never fully separated from that base. Property ownership remained a prerequisite for political representation, and especially for political leadership. In Virginia, the largest colony and one of the most politically influential, most assembly members were large landowners. The same general pattern existed elsewhere. Assemblies were dominated primarily by large landowners, followed by merchants and lawyers. These representatives were often related by family ties to members of the council. They therefore came from the same colonial elite. In New York, for example, merchants occupied 12 of 16 seats on the council between 1763 and 1776, while lawyers held 3. In Virginia, roughly 3/4 of assembly members were large landowners. They possessed more than 10,000 acres of land and substantial numbers of enslaved people, usually between 50 and 300. The historian Merrill Jensen argued that the colonies were dominated by a relatively small group of individuals who owned thousands of acres of land, ships, warehouses, financial assets, and more than 400,000 enslaved people. Colonial political life, therefore, possessed a degree of autonomy, but it remained closely connected to the economic structure. War and the expansion of self-government. Colonial politics was also shaped by international relations and imperial conflicts. The 7 Years' War contributed significantly to the growth of colonial self-government. Wartime administration and the need to finance military operations created conditions in which colonial assemblies, particularly the lower houses, assumed a greater role in financial affairs. After the war, however, Britain tried to restrict local autonomy, strengthen central authority, and increase taxation. The Stamp Act represented a major step toward expanding the power of royal governors. Many colonists perceived it as a form of subordination and oppression. In response, the colonial elite, especially large landowners in the south and merchants in the north, organized local resistance against the act. This marked the beginning of a revolutionary process that gradually undermined British authority in the colonies. The Stamp Act became a watershed. It weakened not only the legitimacy of royal governors, but also the prestige of the Crown and Parliament. Benjamin Franklin before the House of Commons. Benjamin Franklin's examination before the British House of Commons in 1766 is a very good illustration of this transformation. Franklin was first asked, "Do you think the people of America would submit to pay the stamp duty if it was moderated?" He answered, "No, never, unless compelled by force of arms." He was then asked whether taxes in Pennsylvania were imposed unequally in order to burden English trade, particularly through taxes on professions and businesses. Franklin replied that these taxes were no more burdensome in proportion than taxes on land. They were intended to take an equal share of profits. When asked how the assembly was composed and whether its members were landholders or traders, Franklin answered, "It is composed of landholders, merchants, and artificers." Asked whether the majority were landholders, he replied, "I believe they are." Franklin was then asked whether landholders tried to shift taxation away from land and place a heavier burden on trade. He rejected that claim. He explained that merchants and traders were skilled with figures. If unequal burdens were placed on trade, they would simply add the cost for the price of their goods. The consumers, who were chiefly landowners, would ultimately pay most, if not all, of the tax. Franklin was then asked about the attitude of Americans toward Great Britain before 1763. He answered, "The best in the world." He explained that the colonies had willingly submitted to the government of the Crown and obeyed acts of Parliament in their courts. Despite their large population, the old provinces cost Britain nothing in forts, citadels, garrisons, or armies to keep them under control. In Franklin's words, they were governed at the expense of only a little pen, ink, and paper. They were led by a thread. The colonies not only respected Britain, but felt affection for its laws, customs, manners, and even its fashions. That attachment greatly increased commerce. British natives were treated with particular regard, and being an Old England man carried a certain status in the colonies. But when Franklin was asked about the colonists' attitude in 1766, he answered, "Oh, very much altered." He was also asked whether Parliament's authority to make laws for America had been questioned before the recent conflict. Franklin explained that Parliament's authority had been accepted in all laws except those imposing internal taxes. Its authority to regulate commerce through duties had not previously been disputed. The examination then turned to population and trade. Franklin estimated that the population of the old colonies doubled approximately every 25 years. The demand for British manufacturers grew even faster. Consumption increased not only with population but also with the growing ability of colonies to pay for imported goods. In 1723, total imports from Britain to Pennsylvania had amounted to only about 15,000 pounds sterling. By 1766, they reached almost £500,000. Franklin was then asked how Americans had previously viewed the British Parliament. He said that they considered it the great bulwark and protector of their liberties and privileges. They had spoken of it with the highest respect and veneration. Colonists believed that arbitrary ministers might sometimes try to oppress them, but they trusted that Parliament would provide redress when they petitioned it. Franklin recalled one example with gratitude. A bill had been introduced in Parliament that would have transformed royal instructions into laws in the colonies. But the House of Commons refused to pass the clause, and it was removed. When asked whether Americans still held the same respect for Parliament, Franklin answered, "No, it's greatly lessened." And when asked why, he identified several causes. New restrictions on colonial trade that prevented foreign gold and silver from entering the colonies, the prohibition against issuing colonial paper money, the demand for a new and heavy tax through stamps, the removal of trial by jury in relevant cases, and the refusal to receive and hear colonial petitions. Finally, Franklin was asked whether the colonies would accept the Stamp Act if it were modified, if its most objectionable parts were removed and the duty were reduced to a few matters of little importance. His answer was unequivocal. No, they will never submit to it. From imperial consent to revolution. Franklin's conclusion proved to be largely correct. By imposing increasingly coercive legislation, Britain caused a major shift in colonial perceptions of Parliament. Ideological consciousness changed, and colonial attachment to Britain gradually weakened. Nevertheless, colonial customs, legal traditions, and the deeper framework of Lockean liberalism remained highly influential. For that reason, the central demand of the American protest movement was expressed through the Lockean slogan, "No taxation without representation." Even after the Stamp Act was repealed, the processes of political transformation and colonial self-government continued to accelerate. A pre-revolutionary situation gradually emerged. Large sections of the colonial population, politically led by the colonial elite, increasingly sought an end to British rule. At the same time, royal governors no longer possessed enough authority to control the colonies effectively or implement directives from Britain. The colonial assemblies, especially the lower houses, assumed control over most of the key levers of political power. Britain's attempt to restore imperial authority through coercive legislation ultimately pushed the colonies in the opposite direction. Instead of re-establishing control, imperial policy strengthened colonial self-government. This process culminated in the organization of the Continental Congress. Colonial consent to British rule deteriorated, while repressive measures failed to restore imperial legitimacy. The American Revolution was therefore not simply a sudden rebellion against taxation and completely lacking institutional form of organization. It emerged from a much longer institutional struggle. Inside the colonial assemblies, colonial elites acquired political experience, defended their material interests, expanded local authority, and gradually displaced British power. These assemblies began as institutions within the British imperial system, but through decades of political conflict, they became an essential foundation of revolutionary self-government and emerging American revolutionary hegemonic bloc.